Dr. Yadi Wang, I am so excited to be visiting with you. Came across your work with us going to be participating in an event together that Dr. Nasha Winters is putting on in Arizona in October, I believe. And so as I started looking at your work, it's fascinating. It just brings together a lot of that regenerative agriculture we're going after, the nostalgia of a lot of my family being in southeastern Arizona. I thought that's super cool. So if you don't care, give us that little introduction to who you are. I think the story is absolutely incredible, and what you're doing now, as and we'll start breaking down the little pieces.
Well, thank you, Logan, for the invitation here. I'm super excited for the conversation. Come across your work, the podcast especially have been one of the, I think, my go-to every time I'm on the road, drive to the farm. Just there's so many pieces. I think there's a connection. Like when we think about farming, essentially, I think about life. How can we connect that life with human life? And then that is more digestible for people to understand. So I always find that's interesting, like the physicians you're working with and talk about those topics and then kind of link that into what I see in the field and that kind of symbiotic relationship or the connection or equilibrium that really draw my interest. But I came from a very various background. I was born and raised in northern China. Tianjin is the port city next to 70 miles next to Beijing, the capital. And I spent also quite a bit of time in southern China. Went to college there and played um, collegiate basketball, and for 4 years, and then some semi-pro and around there. And that's kind of my background. 17 years of professional athletes history, and then was when I was in China, I was in the financial portfolio background, and I was helping dealing with clients risk mitigation of asset and liability. But moving here, knowing I wanted to change, and went to engineer school, did a chemical and process engineer, and then working in the mining sector for a little bit before uh, transition to my research career as a Earth system research scientist. But that was an accident because I was almost packing up and trying to move to Europe for study solar projects. That's that summer, same summer before I moved, I was managing a program at Biosphere 2 here in Arizona, which is a large controlled experimental site. And that's where I met my wife. And when she left from that program, I chased back to Indiana, realized she's from a farming family, and her dad was a sixth generation farmer. And I believe in, kind of, there's no coincidence, right? So I just kind of chased for that dream, say, well, I need to give a shot for our relationship. That's end up staying here. Um, just cancel my trip and then ask the advisor I used to work for in the laboratory, say, hey, can you guys give me a job? And that's they said, well, how about you do a PhD project? I said, that works. So that's end up for me to study Earth system science, particularly my interest when I was in the research area at that intersect with hydrology, biogeochemistry, and climatology, and all those different sectors, and then all using a soil modeling hill slope and understanding the pedology and as a whole. So it's very complex. And when researchers talk about interdisciplinary study, I think you can't go more than that. But equally, when you have to work with a lot of people, you're still siloed in that kind of standpoint and trying to understand what is the soil water chemistry work? How does that relate it with the other researchers' work? But I have to come back to understand more in detail. So it's siloed in that way. Um, but when my father-in-law he passed away in 2016, that hit me really hard. 1.5 years spending time back and forth between Arizona and Indiana, and then learned a great deal of knowledge from him on farming, but also on how to be a human. And his philosophy was rooted in focusing on family, community, and the land stewardship. Regardless, he was a conventional farmer or locked into the system or not. But the mentality is, how can I bring things back for my kids and my grandkids? And that's something special that clicked for me and really fundamentally set me up to wanting to get involved in agriculture industry. And post COVID, and had the opportunity and to met the founder of the Oatman Flats Ranch, Oatman Farms brand, and that's how I was be able to involve in agriculture, because I came here with two suitcases, and thinking about land price and financial access. That's nearly impossible to start a farm myself. That's almost like a suicide mission. Still, in my view, it's a suicide mission. But be able to learn and grow and understand life. And actually, in fact, I think farming saved my life in ways where I have a different perspective when I look at it. And I connect with my roots, my Chinese roots, more than ever. And it's almost a sarcastically saying is, I have to travel all the way across the globe in order to understand my ancestors' wisdom. But that is true when I start this journey.
How cool. So, you go through this whole layout of things that don't even seem like they go together, right? Like you go from basketball to finance and looking at risk mitigation and to engineering to agriculture. But to me, that may actually be one of the most fundamental strengths that you have, because you're not siloed and you can see how different systems operate, how biology and performance matter to the whole complexity that is life, and then you can see it play out in a farm, but a farm on a desert. So like that is it's really really fascinating. I think important that we hash out the downside of being over siloed. So say you would have gone straight into agriculture out of college, right, or out of high school or whatever, and you only learned one methodology, you only learned agriculture from academia. How do you think that you would view all of this? Would you have come to the same conclusion, or do you feel like that diversity in experiences added value?
It's gonna be completely different, but I wouldn't know unless I'm being a multiverse of different life, right? So, and so I wouldn't know that. But I think, regardless, people say God or other high power. I see things are being planned in a way. There's no such thing called coincidence, and there's a planted route, and there's so many ways to get to Paris, but there's a particular pathway each person chooses to go, and that's different. And that's not a coincidence. That's some guidance and some opportunity, and all those things are combined together, and some risk taking too. I'd say, looking at an alternative way is not my strength, but looking at the present net present value and looking at the future value, I think that's more important. And but go back to, I think, Albert Einstein. I think I look at relativity theory that he developed. I think that's very important. Everything is relative. There is no absolute in this world, regardless of what we're looking at. In agriculture, we're looking at the yield, economic value, time, planting time, harvesting time. All those are important. Or actually, the metabolic process of the plants. When does that plant going through a primary metabolism to proceed forward into a secondary metabolism? That timing is going to change depending on what we do for other things. It's all relative, but what is um, said is the law of conservation of mass and conservation of energy, and to reach that equilibrium. Because when we're looking at the whole system scale, regardless, when we're looking at human system, And we have to reach that equilibrium, be able to function well, be able to reach that highest wellness potential. If we're looking at plants, it's the same way. But when we zoom out and looking at entire ecosystem, and we as a human, regardless us or ants or plants, we are equivalent to that cell. So it's all on the cellular level at one point, is how that cells and cells interact and engage, and how do we actually kind of looking at from the system scale and then making sure everything is in equilibrium.
Yeah. So when I cannot believe kind of the path that I've been able to take. Right, recently I was on a podcast with Dr. Weeping Yu, and he's a NASA physicist. Right, like so that's just mind blowing that I'm being interviewed by a NASA physicist. Right, because I'm a country boy from Arkansas, and in looking at systems, and a lot of what we're talking about with Dr. Yu was light and how light impacts biology, how light impacts physics. Right, and it's not something that I was ever taught, high school, until I started looking into, the self education and having conversations. With, with that, one of my mentors is Dr. Jack Cruz, and Jack talks a little about light, water, and magnetism, right? And to tie in the whole NASA and how SETI looks for life on other planets, it is that combination, light, water, and magnetism. So I'm wanting to tie that back into you because y'all have landed in a place that has intense light, right? Limited water, and not the greatest magnetism. But you are able to push through and alter things in a way that I think is fascinating. And I want to break that down because like you're fighting against two of the three legs of that stool pretty profoundly based on just the geographic location. But also when we look at like Ilion Peregine's work, this dissipative structures, right? It's order from chaos. It's this entropy that is moving through. And so I want to lay out a little analogy, and then I want to get your take on all of this. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I look at ecosystems as a dissipative structure, right? So we have this solar input that then comes and it's dissipated, right? So like I think that the the word balance is probably not the greatest term that we can use within having a conversation because we never really have that balance or that equilibrium, so to speak, unless we have like rigor mortis, right? That's equilibrium, that's balance. But in the example of Yellowstone, for example, I think that you'll like this. When we look at what happened with the wolves, right? When they reintroduced wolves, we changed rivers. Now, on the surface, that sounds crazy, right? This sounds nuts that you can change a river with a wolf, but through this dissipative system, right? We have the solar inputs that builds the fauna, right? The flora and the fauna, the plant life. This gives food to higher chains, and then as that chain goes up, say rabbit to a fox to a cougar to whatever, you keep going up, and that is the transfer of that energy, that entropy through the dissipative system that just keeps going out and becoming more and more complex. When we lost the wolf in Yellowstone, elk didn't move, right? They ate, they overbrowsed the riverbanks. They made a habitat that a beaver couldn't survive, right? All these downstream effects. So, how do you look at kind of that everything from the apex predator to this dissipative system that is, I believe, everything in biology, everything in life, um, but specifically in the ecosystem context? How do if I lost my mind, or does this play into regenerative agriculture as being a complex dissipative structure?
Well, answer your last sentence right there. I think it's not just regenerative agriculture; it's regeneration as a whole. That involving agriculture, that's the food source and fiber and fuel, essentially also into human life and other life, and reaching that equilibrium of the Earth system. But I want to unpack the question you asked. I think there's so much in there, but it's going to be a long answer. But I'm going to start from the foundation first, and from my research and understanding, like when you talk about Dr. Jack Cruz and then his work and what you have been focusing on light. I'm just using light as an example right here and dissect in because that's the photonic energy. And so during my PhD work, and I had an opportunity, which is a great experience, to went to the synchrotron laboratory. There are two in the whole world. One is here at Stanford, is a linear acceleration center, and which you actually um, bombard at the electrons, and then to actually push them to the speed of the light speed. And so that's one here. And in Europe, in Zurich, there's another one, is a circular acceleration center, and it's the same principle. So the idea is you have a jetpack of the electrons, and you push them to the light speed. So which, in turn, that is individual particle will essentially become almost in equilibrium to the photonic energy. But you have to look at it in this way: is the photonic energy is like a drop of water from a faucet. But the synchrotron work, it's pushing the jetpack of these electrons, is actually have a hose. You're setting that into a jet speed, and then that water push out. So that's the amount of energy that you're actually getting from such facility. When we look at the mineralogies in terms of the structure, in terms of the speciation of different elements and composition of the elements, and also the microscopic scale of that mesh, and so we will go to different beamlines, which is and the end cycle of these electrons travel through the end part, and then it will bend because of the electromagnetism, and will bend to different speed, and then land at different beamlines, have different energy for all those different work, and then that you can do. So essentially what does that mean is you are actually using the end life cycle of that energy source to excite the energy site of the sample you're looking at a very small scale, a very small size, and in order to understanding things in more detail. So it's I'd say from that perspective is the quantum chemistry, right? In that lens, it's the physics and chemistry in combination. You study the strength of the bonding, you study in terms of the frequency, in terms of the wavelength, how that lattice structure work, how that being dissected, and how the speciation, for example, using iron, sulfur, the different charges that is embedded in that mineral at the different places, and for different mineralogy identification. And also you can do the structure analysis, microscopic analysis, to see how actually the lattice structure is overlaid on each other at the unique angle, and all those different things. Now that's the foundation of that. So essentially we're thinking about the reason I bring this up is when we think about plants, we always think about photosynthesis, and we always think about um, the amount of energy that is being converted from these little antennas, which is the mitochondria in the plants too, same as the mitochondria in human. In this case, I like always to use plant as an example because everything eat plants. Insects eat plants, animal eat plants, human eat plants, but human also eat everything else. So there's a foundation. If we're looking at everybody talk about soil health, so what is the signature we can see from things we cultivate that everybody use? That's the beginning of the food chain. So most of my conversation will just dive into the plants in this case, and but we never really think about plant just like human. It has its own circadian rhythm too. It's the light and dark control, and that light and dark control at daylight, when you have the sunlight, that's the photonic energy will coming in. You will absorb and convert that energy into a usable form, ATP, right? But at nighttime, same as human, it breathes. It actually exchange carbon dioxide from those stomach opening. Instead of getting oxygen in, it's getting CO2 out. So it's getting more complex there. And the first layer I want to tie into that, the electron, like energy excitation on electrons being kicking off, is think about nitrogen. I use nitrogen as an example to compare to sugar to kids. And that's nitrate nitrogen to plants is equivalent to sugar to kids. So you got plants wound up because nitrate nitrogen is the most oxidized inorganic nitrogen in the entire speciation. That's the +5, that's the charge of that nitrogen. And when we form plant primary metabolism is to actually building its amino acid, protein, starch, all those different things, and use amine as a group. That's the most reduced nitrogen in an organic form. So not only you have to adding so many electrons into that nitrogen to be able to convert that into a usable form, but you have to convert that from an inorganic form to organic form. The amount of energy on that for six, five or six different electron additive in there, the electron excitation can reach to up to 12 point something or 13 point something to 13.2 electron voltage. That's substantial. We're thinking about each matter. Yeah.
Go into that a little bit because like part one way I think that we can understand this better is looking at like chlorophyll, right? This is a magnesium inside of a nitrite cage. This is a photo detector, right? This is an absorber of light. So tie that in for us.
Yeah. So when we think about mitochondria, the photonic energy the mitochondria can provide is about 150 to 200 millivolts, right? Each of the mitochondria. And that's equivalent to 0.15 electron volt. That's a very tiny amount, 0.15 electron volt. And when I talk about the electron excitation on changing the energy state and involving all the electrons it has to add into that nitrogen, be able to have that in order for that to be able to build amino acid, starch, protein, right? In that sequence. And so then we're really talking about that amount of energy, 12 point some electron voltage, uh, amount of energy that has to be sequestered in order for it to convert. And yes, from that reduction, if you're purely looking at redox, we always say, yeah, that you're going to release energy. But energy has to come from somewhere in order for that change and in order to release that small amount. Going back to that way, when the plant consumes so much energy and to actually convert nitrogen into a very simple usable form to form that free amino acid, have the simplest the bonding strings to make the simple protein structure or peptide chain. And it's like a plant sitting on the couch. I'm done for the day. I got brain fog. I can't do anything else. And of course, it stopped at the primary metabolism. It won't proceed into secondary metabolism. Now, going back a little bit, if we talk about plants, it's the metabolic processes. For human, we have 4 different metabolic processes. For plants, it has 2. It's primary and secondary. Primary for its growth and development, that's the primary function, is to building the sugar, amino acid, starch, protein, and those things, and some of the vitamins, right? And the secondary metabolism is crucially important because it create a self-defense mechanism. Is where all the hormone antioxidant can be better utilized in order to actually sequester some of those micronutrients, sequester some or convert some of those vitamins into bioactive form, and then lock into that system so that form can be available for the next part of the food chain in a positive way. So it is very important we talk about nitrogen that limit the metabolic process of the plants. But if we eliminate that, then we can actually proceed that metabolic process. Now, I want to give two examples of metabolic process, how secondary metabolism that can really help in my viewpoint. Soil is a large organism and it's a large ecosystem by its own, and it has the ability to actually form a lot of free amino acid. Some of the nine essential amino acids like histidine, lysine, and tryptophan, right? So those things can be found and formed in soil, can be easily uptake as a free amino acid by the plants, or building into a peptide before it's sucked in by the plants. So of course, the longer you get a tripeptide and polypeptide and all those formed in soil, then guess what? The plants don't have to use so much energy to do its own work. It just simply connect all those chains together and then with a better bonding strings. And there's a lot of leftover energy that can do something else. I use tryptophan as an example always is because tryptophan is a precursor for melatonin. And when tryptophan go either change into auxin or bypass into plants change into auxin, that's when melatonin is being activated. And that's what regulate the plant circadian rhythm and that be able to have that light and dark differentiation. And that's really helping the plants to actually have that redox cycle, be able to regulate some of those micronutrients that is being perceived, particularly those redox sensitive molecules like iron and manganese. And if we cannot have that process done correctly, melatonin as a hormone is not going to activate. And plants is always going to be confused on daylight or night. And just like how those plants living in the vertical agriculture perhaps always have 24/7 daylight to stimulate. And it's not really good because when you lose that biological clock, and there's a lot of certain function you're losing. And so when you activate that, then it can self-regulate and push towards to how do I do as a plant as a function to actually increase my antioxidant level in order to proceed forward. And another example, I think, is vitamin C. I just had a conversation with Dr. Nathan Good here talking about vitamin C. There's a lot of parts that I wish that we talk about those when we study the introduction of organic chemistry, when we talk about the bonding strength, when we talk about the vibration rotation, when we talk about isomers, all those things. Those are basic language. We can flip to introduction of the organic chemistry in college book. Everybody can find those information. It's not something that is so deep that nobody understand, but we never taught in that way. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid. There are so many different forms of ascorbic acid, but only one type of ascorbic acid is bioactive for human. It's L-ascorbic acid. Is this unique rotation of that bonding and the form on that is make that bioactivity. And it's very unstable. Imagine if it's in primary metabolism in that format of the plant, when it has to work with all these other compounds all together, be able to form that larger chain of the protein or peptide profile. And it has to orient itself in order to fit in. So oftentimes you don't see L-ascorbic acid as being too expressive when it's embedded in the primary metabolism. However, if we have leftover energy, that in order to be able to perceive that and lock that L or ascorbic acid into a secondary phase, which its terminal charge will be conjugated and bound with some micronutrient. That's how you make that stabilize within plants. And that's how that bioactivity will translate into human. And so when we go by vitamin, oftentimes that label doesn't express to say, it's only say ascorbic acid. It never say L-ascorbic acid. And some of the most dangerous thing is there's also a thing called D-ascorbic acid. It's a mirroring cousin of L-ascorbic acid. It's the isomer. It's a synthetic, and it's not a vitamin C. It is a preservative, and that oftentimes is using in the food processing. And most time when people say, "Oh, it's ascorbic acid, that's vitamin C, that's good for me," but it's actually doing the counter effect on that. So I'm gonna pause right there. There's a lot of stuff right there, but I want to really point out is the question you were asking me is how this being connected, and I think light is important, but also how do we understand the energy excitation, energy transformation, how not just photonic energy but also electron distribution within the plant system, within life, within cellular level. I think that's where we have the equilibrium, because if we think about a on the periodic table, each element, the elements have a neutron, has a proton, and also have a bunch of electrons. And that's what makes an atom stable. If we miss any part of those, it's unstable.
Yeah. So, there's a lot there, and I'm so excited. Like I can't even wait till we get down to Arizona together and be in person. So one thing that you hit on the whole vitamin C topic is that that's a copper dependent enzyme as well. Like so, like if we don't have copper, nothing works, and so it's not in the processed food. So like it leads to copper deficiency when we're taking the excessive zinc, the synthetic vitamin C, like all of those things, and that's a cascading negative. So I'm really glad you brought that up. You talked about the electrical component and then water. You tied it up. Really made my day because the parallels here with human health are just extensive, and it reminds me of when Jack told me that I was the perfect person as a quote unquote farmer per Jack, that talk understanding photosynthesis is going to help us with health. That is so crucial. So you talked about the voltage 12.2 volts, that but when we talk about a femto or a Pico scale, right? As we get smaller, that is actually increasing the voltage, right? It's all dependent on scale. It's like the inner mitochondrial membrane is 30 million volts, right? It's like equivalent to lightning, but because it's on such a scale, that's held in check by, as you pointed out, water. I think that is such a beautiful piece to this, right? Because you're talking about on the nitrogen aspect. If we're looking at how the inner mitochondrial membrane is producing electricity, but is dehydrated, it throws off the entire system, right? And so if and this goes back to the light, right? If mitochondria produce metabolic water, this is a deuterium depleted water that is a reducer of this electrical potential, and then it's mitigated by melanin, right? And so like you've got all of these things going on. You also laid out the nighttime versus the daytime within metabolism, right? The electromagnetism chemistry, electrochemistry during the day versus magnetochemistry at night is really what's going on there in that vast difference. And I think that's fascinating as we understand those cycles. You also laid out that we have melatonin in plants. I don't know that very many people actually even know that, and that the crossover there for that circadian cycle, that loop, is paramount to understanding that when we are inundated with these toxic blue lights, we're throwing off that cycle. Same for plants, same for humans. When we look at photosynthesis and metabolism, as Jack likes to say, it's a spider on a mirror. It mirrors each other. One, we're taking oxygen and light and carbon and creating carbon dioxide and glucose. The other, we're breaking carbon dioxide apart to provide oxygen and carbon for building materials. I think that there is so much power, and I'm excited that Nasha is going to bring us all together, because the farmers and your deep understanding on bridging some really beautiful things together is how we're going to be able to understand cancer. When you understand that food is a photonic signature, it's a barcode that is made up of protons and electrons. That's what we're actually getting. I think it's just a game changer in the entire conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. And I want to comment one thing when you talk about the inner mitochondria, that 30,000
30 million volts.
millivolts. Yeah, 30 million volts. And but when I talk about that, the electron voltage, that's only on the membrane potential. It's only on the very superficial. And even at that superficial level, if you're not regulating right, if you're not using that energy right, and it can have a very deep impact. But when you be able to use that right, that's where you can actually untap into that potential within the cellular level. And that's something I think is too deep, is way beyond my understanding on my pay grade. But I'm always keen into learning those, and that really brought a great point there. And another kind of common I want to go back is when you talk about um, deuterium water, right? Deuterium in water, or deuterium as a isotopic hydrogen, right? As we use when during a research experiment, we use a lot of deuterium. In hydrology, we call that stable isotope. And every time now I regret it. I do that actually. Every time we finish an experiment, we always cheer with a shot of deuterium water. So it makes me heavier. So I always say, well, it make me heavier, right? But it's actually, now I regret doing that. But going back is really, this conversation, it changed my perspective on some of the modeling we actually really done on the hydrologic flow pathways. We're actually, by adding one more neutron in there, and to make that hydrogen heavier, we're completely changing the bonding strength and lattice structure of the mineralogy, how soil is being formed, how that mineral is being transformed, how the energy excitation, energy stage within that clumps, which will attract or repulse actually different microbial community in that way, because microbes are gram positive or gram negative. And when you change that state of energy within the mineral, within the soil, when I talk about mineral, I think in agriculture, people talk about mineral as a nutrient, right? Mineral cycle as nutrient cycle. But when I talk about mineralogy as a basically the combination of different chemical composition to form the actual mineral, that will go buy from mineral and gem show, those type of mineral. So it's very different. I want to clarify that. So when you change the energy state of that, and everything will change, guaranteed. Because I know that for through the fourth chapter, it was the third chapter or fourth chapter of my thesis, which I delved really deep into quantum chemistry. Actually connect the chemistry part and physics side all together, which was deeply criticized by many of the researchers, because so let me dissect that a little bit. So what I was looking at is, so there's one thing called sequential extraction to understanding whether chemical composition that is weakly bonded or strongly bonded within a mineral structure. Just like, think about if we do a soil sample analysis, either we use ammonia acetate to actually understand the base cation, how much is in there. That's a weak extraction, so to be able to get loosely bonded material. But when you do a total digestion, you're looking at everything that is within the system, and or you use Haney's test, that's using different strains of the chemistry, and be able to get more things out. And people in the agriculture consulting work always talk about, well, a lot of things are locked in, right? And you can't use that. We have to unlock it. It's not really unlocked by changing the nutrient cycling. It's unlocking, you have to change the redox potential, you have to change energy excitation and all those things in order to do that. It's not just the biology, it's not just the chemistry. It adds a lot of components of the physics. It's the frequency, the wavelengths has to be right in order to that bond to vibrate and rotate or in order for that to break or make. So that's more complex in there. But going back to the sequential extraction where we conduct this research, 1 cubic meter of the highly intensive hydrologic processed box, we use volcanic ash as an example. We rained for probably 150 to 200 millimeter per year, right? So that's a lot of rainfall. But the idea is to understanding how much of the water is passed through changing that hydrologic pathway, and what is the uh, microbiological signature evolving that, which we did find something abnormal is photoautotrope at the bottom of that 1 meter depth and survived for 1+ year without sunlight. That is absolutely first transported by the water to there and form that community. And that's a signature of the biological adaptation, where I see that is something that we often ignore. Um, and secondly, is after that experiment, we dissect that into 324 boxes, small voxels, at the length, depth, and width, three-dimensional, and we pick randomized one slice to 81 samples. Sequential extraction, 7 steps. So each sample will get that soil sample, so we can study the two-dimensional from the surface to the depth and how things is evolving based on the hydrologic pathways, based on the microbiological changes over time. And then we can dissect that, understanding how chemistry is changing within that we call each voxel. Through there, think about 7 steps. And so about 20 to 25, let's just use 20 as an example. I probably did more than 20 elements in each of those voxel at each step. So think about 7 step, 7 times 20, that's 140 data point for each voxel. And then you time 81. So that's how many data point from soil sample standpoint that we generated, which I can use that to actually understanding the how weakly, loosely bonded chemical inventory to strongly bonded chemical inventory, those relationship and their space and time in terms of its own particle density of the soil and bulk density of the soil. So then I can parcel it out and derive into theoretic value or empirical equation of a partial density, which I call, and meaning using calcium as an example. If we're talking about loosely bonded calcium, and based on all this computational work, there's an empirical equation for that to know, okay, so in terms of the bulk density of the soil, what is the partial density of that calcium specifically loosely bonded in this pool in relation to other calcium in other space and time? So it's you know that's the level of detail we can do. But what after the work is being done, I get all those empirical equations done, and the work has never been published because I don't see publication as a way, to really help people to change their lifestyle. And two is I feel the work is garbage because so what? Now that I understand all these details at a quantum scale, but every time I change the metagenomic of the microbial community within that group, the coefficient change. It create a new formula. So it is not just chemistry. It is not just physics, and it is not just biology. It's a feedback loop. And there's no such thing we can understand one component will be able to dissect the other component. The answer is no. If we have a different inoculation, particularly happening in that time and space for that period of time, things will change. Just like the first question you asked me, how do you get here? I don't know, because at any given time and space, if anything changed, I wouldn't know the answer. So that was my conclusion, and I think I gone through all this detail. But the reality is, how do we help people understand the things I talk about there? Is fascinating. I think people like you will appreciate, and I appreciate the work because it's so fascinating. Help me understand the foundation. The reality is that cannot be applied, and that cannot help people to understand the lifestyle change, cannot help people understand why do we do this work and what's the implication on that. It's become artistic, and then we spend so much money and dollars and even pursue that publication is sitting on top of the pyramid nobody can reach.
No, I think that's great. But and I think that what you just laid out is kind of my internal struggle on some of these conversations that we have. It's like, so how does this apply to somebody that just got diagnosed with cancer? And at the end of the day, what I come back to is that it's the solutions are really easy for health. Really, it's like get out of the artificial environment, connect with nature, be grounded, be in the sun, have the appropriate minerals. There's so many different things. I want to go in different tangents with you. We'll definitely have to do a follow up. Um, you, the way that you talked about data, I think, is so important that we bridge another layer in here, and that's like the work of Alan Turing or Claude Shannon. And I think you're one of the few that's going to be able to understand that on a context where we're going to be able to have like a lot of deep conversations. Like, I don't know how many farmers know about deuterium and can speak to the isotonic properties of it, and uh, that you can, right? Like, I think that these conversations that you and I are going to have are going to be massive, and I think that we can keep diving around. I've got talking with Stephanie Seneff about bringing in her work from MIT and breaking down Turing and Shannon's work in a way that we can apply it to agriculture, because I think that those things matter. When we understand it, we can justify, or we can help better relay those solutions. I think most of the solutions are relatively simple and less expensive. Granted, in a geographic area like southern Arizona, in the hottest, most extreme environment like in the United States, you're up for a tall task. But for everybody, I don't think it's too outlandish that we just connect with nature, right? And we get more away from the artificial inputs. It's really not that complicated.
I full heartedly agree with you. I think um, its solution is easy, but also is complex. And I think the gift of being able to pursue higher education, be able to get into the nitty gritty detail, and then go back and look at what is the foundation. That is something I appreciate a lot. And as much as I think academia has its downside in what the system we're creating, but I can't ignore the fact that be able to have those opportunity to do that and be able to teach other people in college to learn in different ways, but it's all coming back to the foundation. And some of the most flipped books, I don't read more research paper in ways that I used to. I still look at what is people talking about, but then I will go back to flip those. These are a few books I like to flip. Introduction to Chemistry, Organic Inorganic Chemistry, Introduction to Organic Chemistry, Introduction to Environmental Science. Physics, two books, Forces and Electromagnetic, and Introduction to Cellular Biology or Microbiology. Books like those laid out years and years of work our prior, scientific, researchers have done that could help us understand those things. And I think going back to the education system a little bit is I think we have to find a different pathways to be able to have our professors teaching our textbook in a more relevant way to actually excite the energy from students, so that those if a professor told me, hey guys, they were gonna study you know glucose and fructose. Yeah, both are monosaccharide, but if you kind of relate which one is better, and helping students understand the lifestyle not only their study this, but also the lifestyle of how they should use that. And I think that make a lot of impact to people. And so,
Yeah.
but long story short, I think science do have its own place. I think we still have to putting those foundations out there for not only farmers, for everybody to understand. And going back to the farming side in the hottest and driest area, and I think let's talk about water cycle, because in this type of environment, I never like to use the word desert, because desert is historically has been man-made most of the time. There are very few desert that geologically form, like Gobi Desert is one. But when we talk about Sahara, when we talk about where desertification occur, those are human activities a lot of time. And so that's the lack of the water cycle, essentially. So when we break that water cycle, and water molecule cannot be going through a circular motion and going through one-way direction, that's when we create a drought. And drought has been the buzzword for the Western state, as far as I know, since I get to the United States. But that's the symptom. That is not a diagnosis. The diagnosis is the broken water cycle. So when looking at an ecosystem scale and going into farm, and I think some of the farming philosophy in regenerative agriculture work, I was highly motivated by Alan Savory's work, the holistic management, because it's looking at a whole ecosystem as a whole, and then you're actually trying to create those cyclical effects and to restore that so things can be abundant again. So I think water cycle is a prime example for when we think about arid land or semi-arid land environment, when we're dealing with agriculture, trying to reverse the desertification and be able to create that bubble to start, and which the bubble in scientific word is called the boundary effect. Whether in engineer or in hydrology, that's the boundary effect. How do we set those boundaries in order to allow water not just evaporate, but also condense down? And that's where this water cycle will start. It's changing out of that physical forces by changing its phase through a vapor phase into a liquid phase. And that change in that phase is when we think about dew point. Everybody talk about dew point. Dew point is the function of relative humidity, and in theoretic work it called ambient temperature. But it is not true. It's only relatively true for that temperature. It depending on which part of that boundary you're measuring that ambient temperature. So one very cheap experiment I've did at a farm level to be able to see that effect. Um, um, it's basically using an environmental meter and a ladder that when you create that system, and essentially when you plant different crops in the field, and you have to form that boundary first. In research work, there's one thing called Yadi's tower, so which is very expensive. I think it's $30,000 to $50,000 to form one, build one, and you have all those sensors on there to measure all these fluxes. And the environmental meter is a cheap version. It does the same thing. It doesn't have the set sensor height, but I climb the ladder up and down. I have more data point actually. I can set my where is my boundary compared to a fixed structure. So total is about, let's say $500-700 maximum. You can use anytime, anywhere, remotely, however you want. But before you do measurement, you have to create a condition. So how do you make that boundary? In NRCS, they create these, all these different practices. One of these things called multi-storage. Right? That's an NRCS equipped practice farmers can apply and say, I'm going to practice for multi-storage and to get payment from NRCS. I think that's probably more relatable to farmers to think about this. Um, And the multi-storage in NRCS book right now is set up as you have the tree canopy, you have your top canopy, and you have other species at the lower level. So that's the multi-storage. In their standard, the book is defined how you can receive the payment. However, it can be flexible. Think about multi-species cover crop. You can have tall grasses like sorghum, Sudan, growing up to 12, 15 feet high, using those as your the higher canopy. And you can have legumes, you can have sunflowers, you can get a trellis on the bottom, trail around the soil surface. Then you're actually creating all these different layers, setting different boundaries yourself. And each boundary you can consider as the top of each species or group of species, right? So the very, very top layer will be your 12 to 15 feet high, the top tip top of the sorghum or Sudan. And then going down, you will have sunflower layer, you have legume layer, you have trellis layer on the soil surface. At minimum, you can have 4 different boundaries right there. Let's say those are your experimental data point. So this is very important when you have multi-species. Not only increase the biodiversity, but this height differential will create different boundary. And at the very top, that let's say probably around 10 feet to 15 feet, you probably only have the grass species. Those are very thin layer, of very thin layer of the evapotranspiration occur, right? And as you go lower and lower, as your vegetation density increase, your evapotranspiration increase. And what does that mean is your relative humidity increase within space from very bottom to very top. At the same level, the canopy size will dictate on your ambient temperature in each of those layers. So you can have near ambient temperature, near air temperature of in our hot summer in July, let's say 120-degree on very top of the plant species. Now, as I gradually reduce at the soil surface, I can have 87 or 91 degrees. That's a drastically different effect when we think about temperatures being changed and evapotranspiration near saturation, meaning is almost have 90 to 100% of the relative humidity at the near surface level, whereas the boundary near the air, tip top of the 12 feet or 15 feet, I probably only have 7% of the relative humidity. So that's a drastic differences. Now, when that gradient change during the hottest part of the day, and think about that circadian rhythm change and plant sense that, and going through the nighttime, the overall temperature gradient drop. And that's when we can be able to have that temperature be cool enough and also hold very high relative humidity and in order to achieve dew point. And the next morning you can walk in the field at 5 a.m. and my pants can get wet in the hottest summer with no irrigation. And the tool you're using is a ladder and the environmental meter to measure all those things to allow you understand actually at which height I know water is going to be condensing in my field. And we can calculate based on the total volume of water based on that relative humidity to know how much rain we're creating the next morning. That's how the level of detail we can get into if we understand that basis of science. How do we do the mathematics? How do we calculate? How do we do the critical thinking?
I love it. I absolutely love it. I think that you have made my point and answered that earlier question of how important is the cross interdisciplinary experiences that you've had. I think it's unbelievably important because you're able to see some things that if we were only focused on agriculture, we'd never be able to see. And I think that we probably have a dozen or so topics that are worthy of a full-blown discussion and a deep dive, honestly. And I don't think that we've really scratched the surface. There's a couple of things like within water, about how it is a light absorber and holder, right? If we look at Gerald Pollack's work, if we didn't go into like Nick Lane's Power, Sex, and Suicide, phenomenal book. I think everybody should read that. Or Robert Obecker, Body Electric. And so like all of those, maybe they don't seem like they come together and they matter for the conversation of agriculture, but they do a lot. And then even Fritz Pop or Roland Van Wyck's book, Light Sculpting Life, all of those are so unbelievably important, complex topics that weave together in that lattice work of mental models, that when we understand it and we can put it together, we're going to have better solutions. And so I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It made my day. You breaking down deuterium. Now, don't take any more shots of the deuterium, the heavy water. Don't do
No,
that. But
no.
it's I'm excited to be able to sit down with you at the conference and hear more. Be face to face. I think that's big, and we've got to continue these, because this type of series I believe, can be life changing, world changing.
Well, thank you, Logan. I think, you know, science, if we use those right at the foundational level, we can actually help facilitate not our own life, but also life in general. And that's how I always believe. Let's be the facilitator rather than the dictator.
Amen. Amen.
And it's a very different effect. And then community work, right? Not just the dynamic of the community within our ecosystem, but also dynamic of the community in our life, and all those things are very important. And I think um, that's really delved me into trying to understand what my father-in-law, what he did was serve the community. And what does that mean to myself, to my family, and for people around me? How do you create that? It's not just a symbiosis relationship anymore. It's you're changing the excitation of that energy among each other at the cellular level, that you can experience something that is very much experiential and very impactful.
Thank you, my friend. Beautiful. I love it. I've absolutely just loved this conversation. So thank you. And we're going to visit again soon.
All right. Thank you, Logan.